It was almost midnight as I walked through the empty streets, the cool night air prickling the back of my neck. My friend's house was only a few blocks from mine, but tonight, the distance felt longer, every shadow deeper, every noise sharper. I pulled my coat tighter, listening to the rhythmic echo of my footsteps, half expecting them to be joined by another's. Then, as I turned a corner, I saw it. The narrow street lay deserted, except for a lone black cat sitting squarely in my path, like it was waiting for me. Its eyes were the first thing I noticed, green and piercing. They gleamed even in the low light, staring at me with an intensity that felt oddly human. I hesitated, my gut instinct telling me to cross to the other side of the street, to avoid it entirely. But for reasons I couldn't explain, my feet kept me rooted. A chill swept over me as the cat tilted its head slightly, as if measuring me, judging whether I was worth its attention. Just a cat, I whispered to myself, half-heartedly trying to break the silence. But there was something wrong about it. It wasn't like any cat I'd ever seen. Its fur seemed darker than the night itself, swallowing the dim glow of the street lamps. There was something around its neck. A collar, I realized. Not the kind of collar one would find on a pet, though. It was old and rusted, with a small, tarnished tag that caught the faint light just enough for me to notice strange markings carved into it. They looked ancient, jagged symbols I couldn't decipher, as if written in some forgotten language. The cat blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion, and then rose, turning with a flick of its tail before slinking into a nearby alleyway. I should have just continued home. But instead, an inexplicable urge tugged at me to follow it. My body moved almost on its own, feet carrying me forward despite the creeping dread curling in my chest. The alley was narrow, lit only by a single flickering light at the far end. As I stepped into the shadows, the cat turned back briefly, its eyes flashing, as though to make sure I was still trailing behind. Its gaze was unnerving, a silent, knowing look that sent a shiver down my spine. I walked deeper into the alley, the noises of the city fading into silence, swallowed by the enclosing walls. Each step felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening around me, pressing me further into a darkness I couldn't quite escape. The cat paused ahead, and I followed, almost in a trance, driven by a feeling I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. The cat led me deeper into the alley, each step pulling me further from the safety of the streetlights, further from the comfort of familiar sounds. With every step, the silence grew denser, pressing in on me from all sides. The narrow passage twisted and turned, becoming a maze of decaying walls and rusted pipes, all draped in the same thick darkness. I glanced back once, thinking I could still see the street behind me. But when I turned, I found only a wall. Somehow, without noticing, I'd been led into a place that seemed to defy logic. My heart thudded faster as I looked ahead and saw the cat waiting, its eyes still locked on mine. The pale green glow in its gaze had changed. Where before it seemed watchful, now it was almost expectant. The chill that had been gathering in my chest grew colder, settling into something sharper, like fear. I wanted to turn back, to find my way out of this dead-end alley, but a terrible curiosity anchored me in place. There was something deliberate in the cat's movements, something that suggested this was more than a mere game of chance. A soft rustling sound broke the silence, like dry leaves scraping along the ground. But when I looked around, there was nothing to see, only shadows stretching farther than they should. The cat turned abruptly, darting ahead and disappearing behind a corner at the alley's end. With each step, I grew aware of the weight in the air, a silent pressure that seemed to pulse with an unseen heartbeat. It was a sensation unlike anything I'd ever felt, an invisible presence that made my skin prickle. And then suddenly, I wasn't alone. I glanced around, certain I'd seen a figure at the edge of my vision. There it was again, a figure draped in shadows, almost blending into the wall. My breath caught. It was an old woman, standing so still that she seemed carved from the shadows themselves. She wore a long, tattered cloak, her face partially hidden beneath a dark hood. Only her eyes showed, glinting faintly in the dim light like two smoldering embers. "You shouldn't have followed the cat," she said, her voice low and rough, each word sliding through the silence like a knife. Her eyes narrowed, and in them, I saw something deeply unsettling, something that felt ancient and unkind. What is this place?" I stammered, the words barely escaping my dry throat. She smiled, a thin, mirthless smile that didn't touch her eyes. "This place?" She looked around, as if noticing the walls, the dark for the first time. "This place isn't meant for you, but the cat decided otherwise." Her gaze shifted to the far end of the alley, where I realized the cat had reappeared, waiting patiently, tail flicking as if it were simply biding time. I took a step back, but the old woman's gaze held me in place. "Once you follow the black cat, you're bound to it," she continued, her voice now barely a whisper. "Bound to its curse. The only way out is through." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking into me like stones. Bound to its curse. I opened my mouth to protest, to demand an explanation, but the woman was gone. The shadows swallowed her, leaving only that silent, waiting cat at the end of the alley, watching me, daring me to follow once more. The alley stretched before me, darker than ever, and though I knew I should turn and find a way out, I could feel an invisible pull, a twisted kind of gravity that kept me rooted to the spot. The cat remained at the far end, its green eyes fixed on mine, unreadable yet somehow expectant. I took a breath and stepped forward, feeling as though the ground itself resisted each step, as if trying to warn me. The whispers began as faint murmurs, just beneath my hearing. They rose and fell, tugging at my mind with words I couldn't quite make out. My footsteps sounded louder, hollow and echoing, like I was descending into some unseen chasm. I glanced back at the cat, which had settled into a crouch, its eyes glowing brighter now, almost taunting. The darkness around it seemed to thicken, pulsing slightly as though it were alive. Then, I felt it. A presence. A weight pressing down from all directions, making it hard to breathe. Shapes began to emerge in the shadows, faces that seemed to push through the walls, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Hollow eyes stared out, blank and lifeless, yet full of a terrible anguish that reached straight into my core. My legs felt weak, and I stumbled, clutching at the crumbling bricks to steady myself. But when my hand touched the wall, it felt wrong, almost warm, like flesh. I jerked my hand away and looked up, realizing that the shadows were closing in around me. The alley was shifting, growing narrower, the walls pressing closer as though the alley itself wanted to trap me here. My heart hammered as I staggered forward, desperate to escape. But every step felt heavier, my legs unwilling, as though something was slowly leeching the strength from my body. The whispers grew louder, clearer, and finally, I could make out fragments of their messages. They spoke of loss, betrayal, anger, all centered around the black cat. "Bound to it," they repeated, their voices weaving together in an eerie chant. "Bound by your own choosing." Suddenly, the cat sprang to life, slinking forward until it stood just a few feet in front of me. It looked up, unblinking, and opened its mouth, not to meow, but to release a low, throaty growl that seemed to reverberate through my bones. Behind it, the alley seemed to stretch on into infinite darkness, a path that seemed both familiar and terrifyingly unknown. It wanted me to follow. My skin crawled with the certainty that if I did, I might never return. But I couldn't turn back. The walls loomed over me, the faces in them growing sharper, their eyes following me with a hunger that twisted my stomach with fear. The cat took a step backward, its gaze fixed on mine, then another step, drawing me deeper into the shadows with each movement. I didn't want to go any farther. Every instinct screamed to run. But when I tried to move, my feet wouldn't budge. The cat's eyes glowed brighter, and an icy, unnatural calm washed over me, forcing me to take another step toward the creature. And then another. My feet moved of their own accord, each step drawing me deeper into the shadows. The cat slipped ahead, leading me through the endless, twisting alleyway that seemed to stretch into a void beyond time or place. The whispering voices faded, replaced by a thick, heavy silence that smothered me, pressing down like invisible hands on my shoulders. Then, a chill slithered up my spine as I noticed something strange. Faint symbols began to glow along the alley walls. They were the same jagged symbols I'd seen on the cat's collar, faintly pulsing with a sickly greenish light. I couldn't read them, yet they felt darkly familiar, as if some part of me knew what they meant. Warnings, perhaps, or instructions. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to look away from the glowing inscriptions, afraid that staring too long might sink me deeper into this nightmare. The cat stopped abruptly and turned to face me, its eyes burning brighter now, intense and full of a sinister intelligence. As it watched me, I heard a voice, not in the air, but inside my own mind, slipping in like a thought that wasn't my own. "You chose to follow," it whispered, cold and accusatory. "Now, you must prove yourself worthy to be freed from the curse." The words echoed in my head, sending a surge of terror through my veins. I wanted to speak, to plead, but my throat closed up, paralyzed by fear. I tried to look away, but the cat's gaze held me captive, pulling me deeper into its haunting green eyes, which now seemed less like eyes and more like doorways, leading somewhere dark and endless. Suddenly I heard soft footsteps, a shuffling sound just behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, and saw a figure approaching. It was the old woman again, but this time, she wasn't alone. Shadows slithered around her feet, writhing like living things, creeping toward me. Her face remained hidden beneath her hood, but I could see her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Prove yourself," she murmured, her voice carrying the weight of a command. "Look into the cat's eyes. See what it shows you, and do not look away." A horrible certainty filled me. Whatever the cat showed me would be far worse than anything I'd seen in the alley so far. My instincts screamed at me to run, but the old woman's gaze held me in place, binding me as surely as any chain. Slowly, I turned back to the cat. It sat still, eyes fixed on mine, and the green light in its gaze deepened, swirling like mist in a bottomless pool. And then, as I stared, I felt myself slipping, pulled into its gaze like being sucked into freezing water. My vision blurred, and suddenly, I wasn't in the alley anymore. I was somewhere else. I stood in a dim room filled with tattered furniture and broken mirrors. The air reeked of decay, and the shadows in the corners seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I tried to look away, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, forced to watch as ghostly images flickered into view. Images of people, their faces twisted in terror, running, hiding, screaming. I realized, with a jolt of horror, that they were all staring back at me through the mirrors, their eyes wide with fear. A single thought pulsed through my mind, carried by 1,000 silent voices. They, too, had followed the cat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The flickering images in the broken mirrors trapped me, holding my gaze as surely as if invisible hands had clamped down over my head. Every mirror showed a different scene. A pale woman staring blankly, her face streaked with dried tears. A man, wild-eyed and desperate, clutching his chest as if to keep his heart from breaking. A child, barely visible, her face a blank mask as she pointed to something in the dark behind her. These people, these lost souls, all caught in a dreadful loop of despair, hopelessness etched into every line of their faces. I realized then that I was watching echoes of the past, shadows of others who had followed the cat before me, each one now locked in this grim place, haunted and broken. The room felt alive with their anguish, their suffering somehow tangible, clawing at the walls, seeping into the very air I breathed. I tried to step back, to pull myself away from the images in the mirrors, but a terrible force kept me rooted. And then from somewhere beyond the broken glass, I felt the cat's gaze on me again. Sharp, assessing. Its eyes glowed brighter in the shadows, illuminating the room in that eerie green light. A chill crept over me as the old woman's words echoed in my mind. "Prove yourself." The cat's voice slithered back into my mind, cold and mocking. "Do you understand now?" it whispered. "To follow me is to accept the burden, the curse that binds those foolish enough to choose curiosity over caution." "No," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." "Intent does not matter," it interrupted, its tone low and dangerous. "The curse does not care for ignorance. You have crossed its path. Now you must endure, or become one of them." I felt a surge of terror, realizing what it meant. I was on the edge of being bound to this place, just like the lost souls in the mirrors, doomed to exist in this endless horror, neither dead nor truly alive. The room pulsed with their grief, their pleas echoing in whispers only I could hear. But then, beneath the crushing fear, something in me stirred. Something small, but fierce. It was a spark of resistance, a refusal to be claimed by this nightmare. Gritting my teeth, I forced my gaze back to the cat. Its eyes narrowed as if sensing my defiance. "I won't end up like them," I said, my voice stronger, though I could feel my heart racing, the fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. "Won't you?" the cat hissed, its voice a silky mocking thread in my mind. "Then prove it." I took a trembling step toward the mirrors, toward the broken images, forcing myself to look at each face, each person who had once been like me, who had once had a choice. As I faced them, I felt their despair press down harder, suffocating, trying to crush the spark of defiance in me.